So think about your own academic history for a second. Somewhere out there, right now, a school or university is holding on to your most sensitive data. We're talking grades, behavioral records, maybe even your exact date of birth. And they've probably been holding on to it for literally decades. We're living in this era of incredibly strict data privacy laws, like India's Digital Personal Data Protection Act, or the DPDPA. But here's the big catch. Those generic privacy laws, they simply aren't built for schools. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the unique and honestly often overlooked data privacy challenges facing the entire education sector, and we'll be looking at a highly specialized framework designed to actually solve them. To make sense of this legal maze, here is our roadmap. We'll start with the education privacy challenge, move on to the super data fiduciary, and then tackle the legacy data dilemma. After that, we'll look at protecting minors and students, structuring processes and roles, and finally, retention and audit rules. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Education Privacy Challenge, fitting a square peg in a round hole. You see, educational institutions are a completely different animal. When a typical corporation collects your data, it's usually just for a temporary commercial transaction, right? You buy something, they ship it, transaction over. But when a university collects your data, it becomes part of a lifelong academic record. Because these generic privacy laws have massive blind spots when you apply them to schools, we need a specific solution. And that brings us to the DGPSI-Education framework. Think of it as a bridge. It provides tailored, highly specific standards so schools can actually achieve compliance without entirely breaking the fundamental way they operate day to day. Section 2. The Super Data Fiduciary. The Institutional Umbrella. If you've ever tried to figure out who actually owns your data at a massive university system, you know it's incredibly confusing. It's like a giant puzzle. While education is one of the absolute clearest use cases for a concept called the super data fiduciary. Picture the main university brand sitting right at the very top of the pyramid. That top-level entity owns the enterprise policy, they standardize the consent forms, and they build out the whole cybersecurity architecture. But here is the real kicker. That top-level university brand rarely collects your data directly. Instead, the data processing responsibilities actually cascade downwards. At step 1, you've got that super data fiduciary setting all the big picture rules. Then at step 2, you have the autonomous or constituent colleges. Now this is the real data fiduciary layer. They are the ones on the ground actually running your admissions, grading your exams, and maintaining those student records. And then flowing down to step 3, you have the individual departments, think teaching, research, the library, or even the sports hostel. They generate and process data within their own specific little domains, basically acting as joint fiduciaries or processors. The absolute crucial takeaway here is this. This layering creates dual-level accountability, not diluted accountability. It's a game changer because it ensures that a sprawling university system, with all its online learning arms, research centers, alumni bodies, and international campuses trading under one single brand, can't just pass the buck. The top level owns the architecture for sure, but the local college absolutely keeps its statutory obligations for things like reporting a breach or responding to your data requests. Section 3. The Legacy Data Dilemma, dealing with decades-old records. Now, this is probably the single most distinctive problem that the education sector throws at us. Seriously, how do you retroactively get verifiable consent for a 30-year-old paper transcript? You've got these institutions holding on to physical data going back decades. There is absolutely no realistic way to get retroactive consent for these old files, especially when names might only exist as initials or dates of birth were just rough parental estimates back in the day. It's a logistical nightmare. Fortunately, the DGPSI-Education framework actually provides some very workable specifications to solve this. First up, they use a public notice mechanism. Basically, they put out a call inviting alumni to come forward and flag any corrections themselves. Second, and this is absolutely vital, they retain both the original and the corrected versions of those records. You see, there's a real tension here between correcting inaccurate historical data and preserving the integrity of academic degrees that third parties, like future employers, completely rely on. You just can't overwrite history. And finally, institutions can use something called a documented deviation justification. That's officially documenting the rationale for why full consent recollection just isn't being pursued for these ancient legacy records. Section 4, Protecting Minors and Students. Navigating the Schedule 4 gap. When we talk about K-12 data, and honestly even a lot of higher ed data, we are heavily dealing with minors. So the framework demands a very specific consent architecture with a hard, strict dividing line.
Institutions need a rock-solid system for verifiable parental consent for those liners, but that system must seamlessly transition to direct student consent the exact moment that student turns 18. Having a clearly defined transition point where those consent obligations literally shift from the parent directly to the student is an absolute necessity for compliance. And here is where things get really tricky with the generic law. Under the DPDPA, the Schedule 4 carve-out for children's data is extremely narrow. It really only covers health and safety tracking. That leaves a massive gaping hole. We're talking about things like academic performance data, disciplinary records, extracurricular tracking, and even those modern biometric attendance systems. All of it falls entirely outside that narrow carve-out. So the education-specific framework steps in to explicitly define exactly how to treat these everyday categories of student data that the generic statute just completely misses. Importantly, the framework doesn't leave out vulnerable populations either. For mentally disabled or challenged students, the roles of recognized intermediary institutions, the ones actually providing services to them, must be harnessed. They step in to manage consent and ensure these students' privacy rights are strictly and legally protected. Section 5. Structuring Processes and Roles. The Hub and Spoke DPO. So, when a single trust or society is running multiple schools or colleges, how do they actually organize their compliance without it becoming a total mess? Well, the education variant defaults to a highly efficient structure, the hub and spoke model. Instead of naively assuming everything is centralized, or conversely, forcing every tiny constituent school to hire their own expensive, dedicated data protection officer, they do this. There is one senior DPO at the overarching trust level acting as the hub. Then, you have designated compliance coordinators at each constituent institution acting as the spokes. It's brilliant. You have to remember, an educational organization isn't just one big monolith. It's a massive aggregation of incredibly distinct processes. You have to classify every functional stream separately because the privacy risks are totally different. Admissions and fees, super high consent sensitivity. Exams and results, massive stakes for accuracy. Placements and alumni networks, those create major purpose limitation problems, meaning data collected strictly for your education might suddenly be reused for career services, which is a big red flag. And don't even get me started on campus surveillance and biometrics. That alone could push an institution into being heavily scrutinized as a significant data fiduciary. Section 6. Retention and Audit Rules. The long game of academic records. In the commercial world, data is usually governed by a simple purpose-fulfilled test. Once you've bought the shoes, the transaction is over, and they should delete your data, right? But an educational institution literally can't do that. A degree might need verification 30 or 40 years after the student graduates. Because of this, the framework establishes a differentiated schedule. Short-cycle data, things like your day-to-day attendance or dorm operations, gets deleted according to normal erasure timelines. But long-cycle data, like degrees, transcripts, and exam records, is governed by a fully documented, indefinite retention justification based on its evidentiary function. Under this framework, it is not treated as a compliance failure to keep this data forever. It's a recognized legal necessity. And let's map out what happens when data crosses borders. Because campus data can quickly trigger multiple legal frameworks all at once. If your university has international campuses, foreign collaborations, or study abroad programs, your data sharing puts you in a highly risky dual exposure position. You might actually be triggering India's DPDPA and Europe's GDPR at the exact same time. Furthermore, if a campus admission portal leaks, it doesn't just trigger privacy laws, it inherits cross-mapping from the ITA 2000 for data breaches. This framework is so powerful because it specifies exactly which student data streams sit under which legal regime, rather than just blindly applying a single law across the board. So to pull all of this together and actually audit an institution, the framework utilizes what's called a data trust score. It assesses readiness across 3 tiers: excellent, good, or requires additional measures. But the absolute crucial point here is that this score is calibrated specifically for the education sector. Things like how well university handles its ancient legacy data, its minor consent architecture, and that hub and spoke DPO structure we talked about, those carry much more weight in this score than they ever would in some standard commercial privacy assessment. Which leaves us with this final, overarching question to ponder. How do we preserve the ironclad integrity of academic history while still respecting an individual's fundamental right to privacy over the span of decades? It is a remarkably delicate balancing act, but specialized frameworks like DGPSI-Education are finally providing the structured, nuanced solutions these institutions so desperately need. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep this tension in mind the very next time you think about who is holding your own academic records.